Hello and welcome to episode 1 of the Lady Gardeners podcast. This season is sponsored by one of my all-time favourite gardening brands, the Feverfew Gardening Co, who sell the most perfect gloves for women. They fit perfectly, they're really protective, they've got padded knuckles to save you from those odd jobs, they're bramble proof, they've got a little clip to keep them together so that you don't lose one. They are fantastic and I've been using them for 2 years now and they're still in perfect condition, and I use them 2, 3, 4 times a week to do some heavy duty jobs. So well done Rachel, you have created the ultimate gardening glove. And if you want to get your hands on a pair, Rachel has very kindly given us the code LadyGardener15 where you can get 15% off your next pair. So thank you to Feverfew for making this a reality. Now today's episode is with 2 really inspirational women who have inspired me so much over the last few months to try something that I was genuinely scared of. So Jodie and Lorraine are the Caley Brothers and they have been sharing their mushroom growing adventures with people across the globe, and they've been at shows, they've been doing such an amazing job, and they recently launched their new book, which is Project Mushroom, a modern guide to growing fungi. And it really takes the fear out of growing mushrooms, it makes it really accessible, something that you could do at home on a windowsill, in a shed, in a garage. It's awesome, and I was so privileged to be able to get the chance to chat with them for an hour and share a bit more of their story with you, and also get the lowdown on how to grow mushrooms, the do's and don'ts, and how to eat them to make sure that you actually like them, because a lot of people's fear with mushrooms is that they have a bit of a slimy texture, but they don't have to. You just have to listen to the episode and then you'll find out all the hints and tips. So happy listening, happy shopping, and happy growing.
Very well, thank you.
Hi.
Hello. Very well, thank you.
Good. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. Thank you for making the time. As you know, we've been avidly following the new book and working on lots of projects from the book. We're going to try and make our way through absolutely everything over the next 12 months, and we're probably about 3 or 4 projects in. But it's just been the most fun. We've had such a good time with children from 18 months right up to adults, exploring something that's maybe a little bit, people are a bit unsure on and they don't really know a lot about. So it's been really exciting, and I'm super excited to hear more from you both today.
Oh, thank you so much for having us. Well, that's the book. We are so excited that you are so enthusiastic about the book, and that's exactly what the book was aiming for. Total beginners that sort of cut out all the jargon, really simplify it, easily accessible substrates and projects, and very easy ways to get growing and demystify a lot of mushroom myths. So thank you for that.
And what's lovely as well is you've got a couple of projects in there that are quick fix, so you can get growing. I think you have done, and you've had success quite quickly, and then there are some longer growing ones. So while you've got one on to go, you've got other projects that are a bit of a quicker fix.
Definitely, and for us that's one of the things that we try and integrate into everything that we're growing. So we want to show people things that are kind of that quicker reward for people who are just getting into gardening, as well as those longer term projects where you're like potatoes is 100 days, is kind of the medium term, but there are certain things that you sow in January and you don't see that produce for like a year, sometimes 18 months. So it's really nice to have that kind of breadth of projects that you can get people to. I think we had our first harvest in 3.5 weeks. So it's a really short turnaround, and because something changes every few days, it really keeps you enthused because you're constantly checking back. And actually, when the mushrooms were growing in my little kitchen room, which I'll talk about later, every few hours you could see something different. And I go to the fridge for a snack an awful lot, and it was right by the snack fridge. And so every couple of hours I was just fascinated by the changes. So it's really good. I think great as a beginner growing tool, but also as someone who's been growing for years and years and has grown lots of things that are more traditional vegetables. It's so exciting.
Yeah, it's definitely slightly new, isn't it? Because we find we work with a lot of gardeners who are experienced horticulturalists, and they find mushrooming, you just sort of have to trust the process, don't you? Because you're not watering a soil and putting it, it is very different, but it is very simple. But because you don't see anything, and then all of a sudden it's there, and their growth changing every 12 to 24 hours, doubling in size, it really sort of pins interest. So for someone who can't grow green things, for people who don't have a garden like Lorraine, it really fills a void, doesn't it? And we found that for a lot of people during lockdown, or if they're, they live at home with flatmates or children, it really sort of engages a lot of different types of people.
Definitely. And actually, talking about the really young, much younger audience of children, so we have a group of under fives, which at the moment is pretty much 18 months to 3, and 3 is the oldest child. And it was the most focused we'd ever seen that group. They really, really took on to it, and every single week the first thing they wanted to see was how their mushrooms were doing and how we did it on the book, in the book project. And it was just so amazing to see, and it really held their focus for a long time, whereas quite often it's, you might get them to put soil in a pot and put a seed in, and then they want to move on to the next thing. So it really held their attention.
That's it. And there's always that risk. There's always that risk of overwatering as well, I think, with some things. We both have young families as well. And through lockdown, if every child was watering each project 72 times a day, then that was absolutely fine as well. As long as you're happy to manage the water, it's absolutely fine. But you can't overwater mushrooms, essentially. The demise of most tends to be drying out. So watering is the key. But if you're also only there twice a day, morning and evening, that's absolutely fine as well.
Yeah, the watering has definitely been the demise of one of our projects.
We can help cover that and see what happens. But I think we also, especially in the UK, not so much in other parts of the world, especially Europe, but we grow up with a bit of fungi phobia. And so when you go out on your woodland walks and it's like, don't touch it, it might poison you. And I think when you're cultivating yourself, it takes away any of the risk and it totally demystifies it. And actually in the UK, out of over 15,000 wild species, there are only 6 that are dangerous to us, and they're only dangerous if you ingest them. So you can get out there, and we advocate mushroom spotting. We're not foragers, we cultivate first, but we have gone out with experienced foragers and they identify them for us and tell us what is safe and what's not. But we go out with our children, friends and families, and you can get to know really obvious ones, and if you know that there isn't that sort of risk, then you can go and play, touch, feel, smell, investigate a bit more. And I think for mushroom growing with children, because they have perhaps grown up with that don't touch, when you do allow them to get involved with mushrooms, it feels even more exciting.
Absolutely. And I think on that point as well, it kind of, the growing them yourself almost starts to demystify the mushrooms, because you know from your packet exactly what you're expecting to grow. And so as long as it looks something like what you were expecting, you know that it's going to be safe to eat. Whereas with some of those forage mushrooms, you do get that, I think, like I do it all the time, I'm like, I think I know what that is. Like, I think that's a puffball mushroom. It's a really obvious, you can see it and you know what it looks like. But then I'm like, oh, but what if it's not? Whereas with those homegrown kits, you're like, right, this is what it says on the packet.
That's right. We call it kitchen foraging. So we obviously grow, I keep most of my kits in the kitchen, as Jodie alluded to earlier. I don't even have a garden. So we grow in our kitchen and we call it kitchen foraging. But what we touch on within the book as well, there are things you can do with those forage mushrooms. That doesn't mean you have to kind of eat or consume them. So spore prints are really good. It's one of the key identifiers of any mushrooms. A spore print is like a fingerprint of a mushroom. So it's a great way to identify mushrooms if you are wanting to. But you can also find a bracket mushroom, which tend to grow on the side of the tree. And you can use those to make your own paper, which is good fun. So projects that kind of you or I probably did when we were at school, breaking down toilet paper, the rolls within toilet papers or old newspapers to remake paper. You can do the same with a mushroom like that. Pulse it down, add some water, and you can make your own paper. And then there are some lovely ink caps out there which they melt into this beautiful black ink. Well, it's beautiful unless your children kick them because they're all over their shoes. But if you can harvest them and bring them home, you can actually turn them into a really lovely ink that then creates a beautiful, like a watercolour ink or something if you've made your own quill or interested in printing. It's a fun ink to play. So whether you're foraging or looking for or buying mushrooms, there's loads of projects to do, even if you don't get around to growing them.
That sounds awesome. So before we dive too deep into the kind of projects that people can get up to, I would love to hear a bit more about your backstory and how you ended up being the Caley Bros.
Oh, that's exciting. So we just started growing mushrooms for ourselves. We never set out to be mushroom growers as such. We both had very different careers in the past, Jodie in hospitality and myself in retail. But 2018, we took a bit of a diversion on our diet, tried to go more plant-based. But doing that, we just eradicated meat from our diet, which is actually quite boring if you've been brought up and spent a lot of time with kind of the meat as the focus of your dinner. And we discovered on the internet quite quickly that mushrooms are a really good substitute for meat, whether that's something kind of satisfying and chunky on your plate, or whether it's for the nutritional value. They're full of protein and B vitamins, and if you get your mushrooms in the sun, they can even absorb vitamin D, so they become supercharged with vitamin D. But they're also beautiful. So we started growing for ourselves really to eat, but as anything like that, when you change direction in something, there were a lot of curiosity surrounding what we were doing, and because we were so fascinated in what we were doing, we also wanted to share that information, so we got quite a lot of other people involved. It just evolved out of that, really, didn't it, Jodie?
It did. So we research, we read cookbooks. We're big foodies, cookbooks for pleasure. And we spend a lot of our time deciding what we're going to eat, where we're going to source it, how we're going to source it, we're going to grow it, that sort of a thing. Reading these amazing cookbooks that were mushroom based, and turned out we didn't know where to source an oyster mushroom, king oyster, shiitake. They just weren't around in 2018, and then stumbled across where to buy these mushrooms. A website that said how you can grow mushrooms on coffee grounds, and because my background was hospitality, in our family, we're really practical. We don't say no to anything, and we can do everything and give it a go. That's how our parents were. And so we thought, wow, if you can grow mushrooms on coffee grounds, I know how to get hold of coffee grounds, let's do it. And so we just descended upon our brother's place, which used to be our dad's place, and bought some spawn and got some straw and thought, give it a go, which we did. And it was such a quick, rewarding, as you've experienced it, process. And we thought, well, actually, how do we not know about this? This is madness. So we started growing for ourselves. The cafes we were getting coffee from were really interested. It was quite a new niche thing at that time, and so they wanted to buy back the mushrooms, and then friends and family wanted some of our mushrooms. And we just thought, well, if we're growing for ourselves, let's grow for other people. And actually, both of us were on career breaks to have young families, and we'd had a really intense year looking after our very ill dad, which had prompted the change in diet to go plant-based to sort of support his treatment as well. And then before we knew it, we were just mushroom farmers, and we never really intended to be. And that's how it started. And we just were amazed at how simple it was. I mean, yes, we had lots of trial and error, and when you're growing mushrooms, you can potentially grow lots of mould, and we learned our lessons very quickly. And thankfully, we started off slowly and sort of taught ourselves about grey oysters, and then introduced other oysters, and then we slowly developed what we grow over the years, depending on what we've found work, because we grow in a really low-tech, sustainable way. So there's lots of mushrooms that perhaps won't grow in that environment, so we need to be mindful of what we source for substrate and how we grow. You know, we're not going to warm or chill our space. We don't want to utilise that sort of energy. But yeah, it went from strength to strength, didn't it? And after lockdown, people wanted to know how to grow, so we started doing workshops. And I think we've always been very passionate, because we're still amazed at how simple it is, and we're amazed that people don't know how to grow this very easy thing. You know, at school we learn how to grow cress and a broad bean and plant sunflower seeds, and so we do the basics of growing. But mushrooms, whether you're growing for health benefit, your mental health benefit, because they are so quick rewarding, you know, it's really joyful. Soil health, as gardeners, you know about the mycelium benefits in soil. Everyone comes at mushroom growing from a different perspective, and so we just get out there and think everyone needs to know how to do this. This is amazing.
And I think that your enthusiasm is so infectious. I know that, like, we'd been talking about mushroom growing for a long time, but as I said to you earlier, it kind of freaked me out that at the speed at which the fungi grows. Whereas my sister absolutely detests mushrooms, has hated them her entire life, but actually was fascinated by how mushrooms grow, and she's read a few books on mushrooms, and I think there's a Netflix documentary about mushrooms, and she's got a really sciencey brain, so that really drew her in. And so she was obsessed with starting to grow them. So when we got your book through, we were like, this is the perfect opportunity to kind of conquer my fear and get Tan trying some new mushrooms. And funnily enough, we'd actually been to a very fancy restaurant a few months earlier, where one of the 7 courses, it was a proper like celebration. We'd been a year in business. One of the courses was this tiny little thing of mushroom soup. And I said to Tan, I was like, oh, you like, if you don't eat it, I will, because it's delicious. And she was like, oh, I'll give it a go. And she devoured the whole thing. And I think that obsession with the science behind it had kind of altered something in her brain, that she was like, no, this is actually nice. So we're kind of slowly convincing her into mushrooms. But I think a lot of the reason people don't like mushrooms is from having them cooked in a bad way. And actually, supermarket mushrooms versus the ones that you guys are growing are worlds apart. I'm not saying they're not the same thing, obviously they're both mushrooms, but you can do so much more with them, and there's so much more to be interested in rather than a simple button mushroom, although we're also growing button mushrooms and that's super fun too.
Right. I didn't like mushrooms. I don't know how you felt, Jodie, actually. We've never delved into this part of our history. Our mum was really, she was kind of a bit ahead of her time when it came to cooking stuff. So she was discovering things like lasagna and spaghetti bolognese and chili con carne, and wanting to try these recipes out with us. And she tried. And then had boiled eggs in lasagna once, which we're not sure where she got that from. But mushrooms and mussels and all that sort of stuff was her thing. But we were adamant, being young children and not very forgiving, that she was feeding us slugs from the garden. Because they were cold and they were dark and they were slimy. And
that's exactly what my sister compares them to, slugs.
That's right. And then we've obviously, as we've got older, our palate has changed, and we now actually really like the idea of garlic mushroom that used to get everywhere in the kind of 80s, 90s. But what's lovely is about the oyster mushrooms, they are different from your button mushrooms that you get in the shops. They're a lot lighter, they're a lot less dense in moisture, and actually if you pan fry, and this is any mushrooms really, because mushrooms are so dense in water, the more you move them about, the more you break down the cells, the more the water kind of emits. But if you just dry fry and leave them still and don't push them around the pan, halfway through turn them over, you'll actually find they begin to go brown. They brown up a little bit, they crisp up. And then halfway through, turn them over and then leave them a little bit longer. And then when they're ready, they retain their kind of texture and their firmness, and they haven't emitted that water that's kind of puts a lot of people off. And things like pink oysters and yellow oysters, they're a little bit sweeter in flavour as well. They're not as mushroom. I mean, they're all still very undertones of mushrooms, but slightly sweeter in their texture and taste as well.
Yeah, I love it. I love finding out about more of them. What I was also really interested to see was the other day in like Tesco's, they had a mixed pack of like exotic mushrooms, which was all the oyster mushrooms. And my boyfriend, he's been adamant that he won't eat them at the moment. He's like, I just don't trust the ones that you've grown. And I'm like, one, they're going to be much better. Two, they're now in the supermarket. So now that you've seen them packaged up in the supermarket, and that the supermarket are giving you the thumbs up that they're okay to eat, are you maybe more convinced? And he's getting there. I think maybe in a couple of months we'll manage to get a homegrown mushroom into his dinner.
That's it. But it's like any produce that you grow yourself. The flavour is much more intense, and the texture as well. So mushrooms in supermarkets, they've wrapped in plastic, so they get a bit, because they're so full of moisture, they get quite sweaty and a bit limp, and so they're much firmer in texture. I've actually picked some shiitake that we grew. So we do really big shiitake.
Awesome.
Whereas maybe they're maximum this size, so much bigger. And we actually use these, we breadcrumb them and use them like in a scallop, don't we? What's the name of the food? But yeah,
like a schnitzel type thing, isn't it?
Like
bread and fried.
Schnitzel, and it's got such a beautiful meaty flavour. And you know, in a schnitzel, the thing that I want isn't really the meat; it's that beautiful breadcrumb with some lemon, and some herbs, and a lovely sauce to go with it. So it's about growing your own, enjoying the freshness, the intensity of flavour and texture.
Absolutely.
It's also, their texture is very good. They're very good at imitating a lot of meats as well. So we've used them rather than trying to reinvent our kind of meal repertoire, especially with young children. That was the hardest part about going more plant-based. But what we've actually found is mushrooms are a really good swap out. So if you get something like a button mushroom from the local supermarket and chop it finely, you can use that as a mince replacement, and it acts as the same as mince. You know, the water emits and then it kind of evaporates and then it kind of intensifies in flavours. So mushrooms are really good at kind of imitating. Like a torn chicken can be replicated with a torn king oyster mushroom, which is really beautiful, or any other oyster mushroom. My favourite discovery at the moment is if you actually get a king oyster and slice it, so you've got your little discs, and scowl those and then fry them on both sides. They imitate a scallop quite nicely, but without that risk of overcooking that scallops come. They go from that perfect position to overcooked so quickly, but a scalloped king oyster is really beautiful.
Ooh, see, I've always had a thing about the texture of scallops. I think that the taste is nice, but the texture for me is just weird. So maybe that's my alternative.
It's worth a try, isn't it?
Definitely. And I really like your point on it using it as a substitute, because something that, now this might be a bit controversial, but my brother's a vegetarian and my boyfriend's a vegetarian. And I'm really, not really anti, but I just am a little bit anti using processed alternatives that imitate meat as closely as possible. Because for me, if you're a vegetarian, you should be utilising vegetables and making the most of the vegetables rather than trying to buy something that's been processed beyond within an inch of its life. And I know that a lot of those are based off mushroom. Some of them like pea proteins or tofu, like processed tofu and soybeans.
Yes.
But what you end up with is essentially cardboard food that you're having to add so much to make it edible. And for me, that's not the point of being a vegetarian. Like, you want to have really good food that is made from vegetables.
That's it. We were I started using kind of the processed vegetarian mince instead of mince for the mince, but I found myself flavouring it with mushroom powders, and that's when the kind of light bulb moment came on. I'm like, why am I'm drying mushrooms and turning them into a powder and then using them as a flavour of this cardboard food? Why don't we just go direct to the mushroom and utilise the flavour and the texture and the water and the juices in the mushroom, and the process of it, chopping them up is quite therapeutic as well. So exactly, no, they're a great alternative.
Live as well, you know. I mean, gourmet mushrooms aren't the cheapest. You can still use your button mushroom for mince and things, but if you're buying a processed meat substitute and then having to add flavour, financially, it's not making any sense. And also, we believe in whole foods, and that by using the processed meat, the pretend meat, then you're using something that's adding processed food, ultra processed food into your diet rather than being healthier as a vegetarian. I think that's a personal opinion.
Agree.
Yeah, balance.
I think something else that's really interesting is, I don't know if you guys have watched Clarkson's Farm, but the amount of people that have watched Clarkson's Farm and have suddenly got like I would say since the new season came out, I've had hundreds of people asking me about mushrooms, whether that's at work, like friends and family, people on Instagram, being like, so I've just seen on Clarkson's Farm and I've watched his journey, and I think, although Jeremy Clarkson is definitely not my favourite person, it's another one of those things where it's made mushroom growing much more mainstream because people have seen it happen and they've seen some of the challenges and some of the rewards that have come from that. Obviously, we just need to grow on a much, much, much smaller scale. I was watching him putting all those bags into that room, being like, we've got like 1,000th of that and it's too much.
I think we had to watch it as research, didn't we? Because I'd seen it. We had a really busy schedule in the run-up. We do a lot of sows, sort of every 2 weeks. It was from March this year. And so I'd seen it because I love Clarkson Farm. We grow on a farm in West Sussex. We rent farm space. And so to know and understand their challenges as farmers better. Clarkson, love him or hate him, he's got an incredible platform and he's using it brilliantly. And he absolutely knows his entertainment worth. So he would have known full well, opening 200 of those would have caused absolute chaos.
Yeah.
And, hats off for doing it. But using that platform, I'd never thought. And so I'd seen the trailer. It's like, he's doing mushroom farming? This is mad. And when we did our first show, have you seen Clarkson? Have you seen Clarkson? Have you seen Clarkson? We had to come home and watch it. And so we were watching with gritted teeth because we do, obviously, the projects and the individual pits so people can do it on their windowsill. But commercial farming for fresh is a whole different. You know that 98% of our time is spent cleaning and managing stock and rotating and selling. It's a full-time, very hands-on job. So not to take it on lightly. So when he was doing that alongside his little piggies and the farm shop, I just thought, how on earth is he going to do it? And we all saw it.
Yes.
What I wanted to come back to actually was, you mentioned earlier low-tech growing. So obviously Clarkson's Farm, I think he spent maybe £10,000 on converting that room, setting up all the storage, and then obviously with the quantity he bought would have been like a very expensive initial investment, and he showed that he made his money back at the end, which is brilliant. But I think that is definitely, when we started looking at mushroom growing, a lot of the research we did drove us to, you need a completely clinical space that's refrigerated, that's got all of this high-tech equipment. And from what we're trying to do with the Gardeners Co, we're trying to make gardening as accessible as possible. We don't actually want to grow anything that you couldn't just grow at home. And so we looked at converting. We've got this old linny that's got 2 floors, and there was a sort of attic room, and we were like, oh, we're going to turn it into the mushroom, it's going to be amazing. And then I looked into it being like, we could set up like a small scale mushroom farm. And when I looked into the farming side of things, I was like, this is going to cost us thousands of pounds. And what we're going to achieve is that we're going to sell mushrooms. And actually, as a CIC, our entire mission is about showing people what they can grow at home and making it accessible. And thousands of pounds worth of equipment is not accessible. So I think it's brilliant, and this comes back to the book, of how easy and accessible it can be from some of those projects. And the projects that start from you're seeing results within 3 or 4 weeks, to the ones where you might be setting up the logs for sort of a year down the line, or the bigger hay bales where you're maybe waiting a few more months, but then you've kind of got all scales to work with so that you kind of keep interested in the projects.
That's right. So Clarkson, he would have done, and we've set up a grow space as well, and it becomes a controlled environment more than anything. So our produce we can calculate it and time it, and we've got a bit more control over it, because like you say, outdoor growing is a bit more dependent on the weather and on the happiness of the mycelium and the soil and everything around it, which again is fine, but that's when you're growing outside, you're kind of embracing all those elements anyway, and different years offer different weather conditions, which offer obviously different crops. There was a lot of muttering in the background at a lot of the shows we've done, this kind of echo of Clarkson's Farm as people walked past. And a lot of people came forward and they said, but he had this dark, damp space. And we were like, well, it was dark because it was a bunker, but he would have had lighting on timers in there and humidifiers to keep the humidity up. And they thought they were having to recreate these at home in order to grow their kit. But as you said, he opened 200 kits and needed that environment. So he wasn't having to manage it himself personally. It could kind of maintain itself day in, day out. But with a simple grow kit, like you say, you can recreate that space at home. They do need light to grow, and just with your little plant mister, it's absolutely fine to give your kit a bit of a misting twice a day, and that creates the humidity at home quite nicely, yes.
And because it's so interesting and it happens so quickly, you want to go back and check on it. It's not like people say, oh, I can't keep a houseplant alive because it needs too much effort, and then they hear twice a day and they're like, oh god, twice a day. But actually, when it's somewhere like in your kitchen windowsill or like in a bathroom where you see it constantly because you're constantly in the room, you only need to be in that room twice a day for breakfast and lunch, or breakfast and dinner, to remember to do that thing. And I think you get really invested in it as like a child. It's your little baby that you're looking after and caring for until it fruits, and then you're like, oh my god, this is amazing.
Yes. And it's just a 2-3 week investment, and like you say, it's been described to us like a 4-day Christmas, especially with young kids, because you've got about 10 days where you're watering it, if that, and it's kind of, you get to this 10 days, you're like, is anything going to happen? And then something pops, and then every 12 hours, like you say, in the morning, in the evening, and then the following morning you come down and they've doubled in size. And this person that described it as Christmas, it's like there was no request for food, screens, or anything else in the morning. The kids were up and downstairs to see the mushrooms. That was their priority, 4 mornings in the trot. And then the 5th morning they harvested them, they all tore them up and put them in the frying pan and then ate them together. And they just said they've never seen their kind of kids enjoy mushrooms that much, let alone kind of be invested in anything at that level for such a long period. I say long period, 4 days, but that is long in the world of children, isn't it?
It is. 5 minutes is long in the world of children retaining focus. So do you have a favourite variety or favourite method of growing? I think your kits are absolutely brilliant. I grew my first ever mushrooms with you guys, and it was one of the Lion's Mane mushroom kits, and it was just so much fun. But I'd love to know what your kind of golden goose is of growing mushrooms.
I think Jodie and I have 2 very different probably takes on it as well, because I'm based in West London, so I do a lot of the kind of internet admin, computer work, but I always have an array of kits. So I really enjoy the oysters just because they pop so quickly, the kids love them, and I like experimenting with cooking with them. But where Jodie's based down on the farm, I think you've got your favourites for different reasons, haven't you?
I do. I think shiitake I love because they were a real pickle to learn how to grow, especially in a low-tech By low tech, I mean that we don't sterilise, we just pasteurise. So we're using less energy in what we're doing, but also we use substrates that are easily accessible. So they're what would otherwise be waste from industry or agriculture. So we grow on straw from the farm. We collect coffee grounds from near where we are, and we use sawdust from the local sawmill. So not beating the shiitake, I should say, learning how to cultivate the shiitake under those conditions was a real challenge. So when I did get to it, I really enjoyed eating them, and I think they're still my favourite because they were so challenging. But also, like Lorraine, the oyster mushrooms. We do lots of exhibits with mushrooms. So this year, for Monk, the glasses, where Lorraine in her flat created this incredible jeans sculpture around a ring that we'd sourced, and so she made that. And you can use grey oyster to make sustainable materials, so it's taking over from polystyrene in packaging. And we made all of our pillars this year at Chelsea and Hampton Court out of toilet roll holders and straw and sawdust as a way of showing accessible low-tech ways of growing, and so they were all fruiting during the exhibit. And because oyster mushrooms will grow on pretty much any organic natural material, as you've seen before, the books, jeans for sculptures and pillars and that sort of thing, I think, and coffee grounds as well. It just needs coffee grounds. It doesn't need any more than that. I think the grey oyster is a champion for getting people inspired, but I think my personal challenge that I overcame was the shiitake. And yes, I enjoy eating them all the more because of it.
And they're delicious. They're really intense in flavour. They're like the Tesco finest of the mushroom world as well. They're a really beautiful meaty mushroom.
Yeah.
And so, from a personal point of view, what do you guys eat most of your mushrooms fresh? Do you do a lot of dehydrating? How do you kind of make the most of your crops?
Oh, we do a little bit of everything actually. Fresh, perpetually fresh. And even we get asked a lot when you see mushrooms in restaurants, do you always go for the mushroom dish? And the answer to that is more often not than yes, absolutely. So it makes the decision making a bit easier as well. But then because of the nature of the farm, we sometimes don't have enough to dry, but if we've got an excess, then we will always dry them. The flavours change quite a lot once you dry them as well, especially the pink oyster mushroom. Pink and yellow, they become a lot more intense in their flavours. So if you've got an excess, to dry them and then to turn them into a powder, you can then add them to so many things to kind of really add this kind of umami kick. So we really like to put mushroom powders into, I say sneak things, mushroom powders into brownie mixes, pasta, if you're making your own fresh pasta, bread mixes, all of that sort of stuff. And it's a really good sauce thickener as well. If you're making something that just needs a bit more depth, either physically or in flavour, you can add it on. It's a way of the children, as much as my children enjoy mushrooms and like mushrooms, they also don't want to eat mushrooms on a daily basis. But because we know the goodness of the mushroom, especially a dried mushroom in the sun, the extra vitamin D it brings to the table, if I can sneak them into a bolognese sauce or a soup in powder format on the guise of thickening up and adding flavour, then we do that as well.
That sounds awesome. There's also, so bringing it back to my sister, I actually had no idea that you could use powdered mushrooms in quite so many ways until last October. We were at the skate retreat with Danny. She used to be Plot 81, and I can't think of what her new handle is, but she's awesome and she does a lot of foraging. And she, before the retreat, prepared a lot of her own kind of like pickled produce and dried mushroom powders and things like that. And one of the dishes that this amazing chef called Nicola and Terry, they both worked together and they just created the most amazing dishes. There was one that was like a mushroom sausage roll, because everything was plant-based. My sister ate it and enjoyed it. And there was these potatoes that were just small, like cubed up potatoes, and they were basically just seasoned with garlic and porcini mushroom powder. And everyone was eating these potatoes being like, oh my goodness, this is the most delicious potato I've ever eaten. Like, what is it that's on them? And you would have never known that it was porcini mushroom powder because it didn't taste mushroomy as such. Yeah. It was just so full of flavour, and it felt like there was like 10, 12 different seasonings on it because it had real depth of flavour, but it was just garlic, salt, pepper and porcini mushroom powder, and it was epic.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. I've made note of that to
try out. It's just adding that umami undertone that food, you really craving food, quite addictive. And so yeah, that's I think that's why we're so fascinated with it. We actually we put mushrooms in so much that we've infused gin with shiitake mushrooms.
Ooh.
We thought, because we love a gin and tonic, and we thought when we were talking to Gin in a Tin about it, the pink oyster mushrooms, if we could have a pink mushroom gin, it would be incredible. But actually, the flavour wasn't very nice, was it, Lorraine, when they distilled it? So they tried it with some shiitake mushroom, dried shiitake, because of that lovely intensity of flavour and subtle. It doesn't taste like a mushroom. It's just got this lovely savoury undertone, and that's what mushrooms bring into recipes.
And I think it's probably what's missing from a lot of our cooking repertoires is that there's not very many options, especially in the UK. It's not that there's not many options, we're just not very aware of those umami flavours in our foods. Like, it's just not something that comes into classic British recipes, but actually has so much to offer to kind of spice up everyday dishes.
Yeah.
That's right, yeah. I think we grew up a lot with using a lot of like gravy powder in a lot of stuff to add a bit of intensity. If in doubt, shove it, the Bisto's powder, you can put that in. And we, I suppose we're beginning to supplement all those things that we've used in the past, like processed or packaged stuff. Mushroom powders, again, taking over from those.
It's such an exciting place, and I think that it's brilliant that so many more people are going to start doing this now, whether that's thanks to videos that they've seen of yours, whether that's Clarkson's Farm, or the shows, because your displays at the shows the last few years have just been insane. And I think that it must be so exciting for people who can see, especially for you guys, to see the process of those mushrooms growing day by day in the show itself.
Yes, I think that's the biggest thing for us is bringing mushrooms. We say we're bringing mushrooms into the light for everyone, and just they're the questions as well, aren't they, Jodie? We get these questions, every kind of regular questions that come out when people see us, like, oh, mushrooms, oh, are they edible? Don't they need the dark? And what do they taste like? And so it's really nice to kind of to talk to people there and then in person about what they're looking at in front of them and the difference between the different mushrooms and stuff like that. So it is nice to, because if you don't know about them, how are you ever going to learn about them as well, or extend your kind of curiosity? I think there was that issue many years ago, wasn't there, or criticism of kids in school not knowing necessarily where milk came from, or that carrots grew in dirt. And I think there's still a bit of that regarding mushrooms. We're taught about flora and fauna at school, but not necessarily fungi.
Absolutely, and it's such a fascinatingly different process to any other type of growing. It's not like sowing a seed or putting, I can't even think of another example, but it's just not like typical gardening. And watching that mycelium start to cover whatever substrate you're growing on is such a fascinating experience. And I think that it's like every school should have mushroom growing in the curriculum. But interestingly, from a few schools that we've worked in, they're like, risk assessment, mushrooms is just an automatic no, because if there was mushrooms growing on the ground, no one would be allowed to touch them. You'd have to remove them before the children came out to the garden, and there's just that real fear around them.
Yeah, but if we don't talk about them, I suppose then we never tackle the reality of how, or able to kind of do those proper risk assessments either. We have a coffee kit project on both in the book and on our website, and what we like about that one is it's about collecting your own coffee, whether it's from your own consumption or even just the coffee shop from down the road and asking for a kilo. But what's lovely about that is over the course of 21 days, your coffee goes from kind of being brown and soft and smelling of coffee within the kind of the grow bag that we supply, to white and solid and smelling of mushrooms. And that's a 21-day process. And then once you've gone through that process and you've now got this kind of mycelium block ready to grow, you open it up and grow mushrooms. And that's a 5 to 6 week process, which is the perfect term time window. So mushrooms are meant to be in school.
They were designed for schools.
Yes. Well, if you just started growing mushrooms, you're talking about substrates, you growing on waste. You can do it from an art, a biology, a chemistry, a just DT. It can be a whole, a whole world approach to it. And I think that is, our next mission, isn't it, Lorraine? Is mushrooms in schools from a holistic approach. I think it's
100% on board with that. And so for those people that might have a bit of a sort of fear about growing mushrooms, Can you talk about a few of the risks, things that can go wrong and things to maybe watch out for when growing mushrooms? Because from my understanding, there's not much that is going to go horrifically wrong that is going to poison you.
No, so generally, I mean, it's quite, when you're growing mushrooms, if you're doing indoor cultivation, then it's very simple, because you're buying, and we always recommend that you buy your spawn, which is essentially the mushroom seeds from a reputable supplier. So that would be a company with a face that can ask questions, that are really engaged with what they're doing. They really want you to succeed, so they're there to advise. And then you know that you're buying a good quality UK made product. So the spores that you buy will be that mushroom, and then you're going to put that on a substrate that you have sourced. And there's ways to do that, whether it's coffee or a book or some jeans or some straw, and you know that in that space you are growing that mushroom, and so that alleviates the sort of the fear or the risk of perhaps poison from a wild mushroom. And you know that when you're growing that mushroom, very quickly it's quite black and white, so your mycelium will grow nice and healthy and it will colonize that substrate, or you'll grow some green mold, it won't succeed and your mushrooms will not grow. So it's obvious, because the turnover, the incubation period for an indoor kit on something like that is just at least a maximum 21 days. And so you'll know very quickly within 7 days whether you're going to grow white mycelium or green mold, in which case you take it out of your house and then you compost it, and if there's any living mycelium, it can go and feed the ground quite happily. So that's the other thing. I think also you would have seen perhaps on Jeremy Clarksman, when he was in his bunker, he was wearing a respirator. And that's because if you're growing large quantity of mushrooms, then there is a risk of those spores dropping from the mushroom, from the gills of the mushroom. And a mushroom in its lifetime will release billions of spores, but we inhale wild spores as we're breathing each breath now. But you don't want a concentrated amount. So we always say that if you're going to be growing over a 3 kilo kit, then you need to do that in somewhere that's ventilated. Perhaps think about outside growing, because you don't want to be inhaling a lot of spores at once. So we grow commercially in a barn, just like Jeremy does, but so it's a controlled space. So when we're in there, we'll always wear respirators, because so that's a concern. What other concerns might there be, Lorraine? I think those would be my main two. I guess there might be questions that people will ask online, and then we can answer those.
Yeah, they're the unknown. Yeah, the one we get asked a lot as well is, aren't they going to turn my furniture mouldy, and will I end up with dry rot? But they're different types of mushrooms tackling a different type of substrate. So an oyster mushroom isn't going to be interested in antique furniture, pine chopping boards, or old oak floorboards, because they're not the conditions. Those mushrooms are not looking for those conditions that you've got there. We've created the perfect condition and the perfect substrate for them to grow. So there's not really any worry there. I think the other one is sometimes the mushrooms, we try and guide people to harvest their mushrooms when they're at their peak. So when a mushroom hits kind of maturity, it then kind of starts dropping its spores, and that's when they're kind of going off to reproduce. That's them hitting their peak position. But the window for kind of perfect harvest and dropping spores is about 6 hours, and that usually happens when you're not looking, as with most mushrooms growing. So you will kind of see your mushrooms at night and think, are they ready to harvest? I'll leave them till the morning, and you come down and then you realise there's this kind of white dusting underneath your kit, and that's overnight your mushrooms have started dropping their spores. And that's your kind of key sign that they're ready to harvest. But those spores, there's nothing harmful in those. They're quite fun, actually. My kids tend to get up in the morning and they've graffitied in them with their names and various other words with their fingers in the spores. But a damp sponge will clear them up quite happily, and then harvest your mushrooms. And if you're not ready to eat them straight away, you can kind of pop them gill side up in the fridge, and that stops obviously any more spores dropping on a plate or anything like that. But the spores are fairly harmless are fine in well-vented areas, and obviously not too concentrated.
And you said something really interesting earlier about letting the mushrooms soak up the vitamin D before, so once you've harvested them, you leave them in the sun?
Yes, absolutely, if you can. Get them on a plate in the sun. The kind of pure sun, so not in packaging or with a tea towel or anything over them or through a window. So mushrooms contain something called chitin within their makeup, and they are able to process the vitamin D from the sun, a little bit like us in our body. So if you can get even shop-bought mushrooms or homegrown mushrooms, even though they've been harvested, if you can turn them upside down and get them in the sun, they absorb that vitamin D. They store that vitamin D. So once you've bought them inside, even if you've just done an hour and they're back in the fridge, that's fine. But if you can dry them out in the sun, by drying them until they're kind of cracker crisp, that you can kind of snap them, you can then preserve, the dryness is going to preserve those mushrooms over the winter. So you can then use them through the winter. You can kind of rehydrate them with hot water, and then you've got a lovely stock, or you can turn them into powders, and then you've obviously got this vitamin D kick throughout the winter that a lot of us, either that are more plant-based or in fairness, anyone within the UK, obviously needing. It's quite difficult. It's not natural forms of vitamin D otherwise.
I mean, we've barely even seen the sun this year as it is, so I'm sure that we're all lacking in vitamin D.
Outdoor growing mushrooms, it's been absolutely perfect. And actually at some of the shows, it's difficult exhibiting mushrooms because they dry out and they change so quickly. And so year before last, Chelsea was really hot and dusty, and so the mushrooms were drying out really quickly. And during the sell-off, people wanted to buy the mushrooms. But this year it was much wetter, and our mushrooms just looked gorgeous the whole time. I think we were the only people in the floral marquee that
Praying for rain, exactly.
That is awesome, and one of my favourite things within the book that I'm most excited to try is the vase mushroom displays, because what a good idea. We don't always need, like, I'm a big advocate for freshly cut flowers and I love growing my own flowers, but a vase of mushrooms would just be awesome. It's like centerpiece for a table, something to go on like dressing table side. They just look stunning.
They're a really good project to play with. So it's, again, a really simple project. It's great using fresh spawn and then sawdust. So we rehydrate sawdust pellets. It's a really easy thing to do, again, low tech. And all you need really is to find your own vessel to grow out of, anything that holds about a litre. And it's been quite fun kind of experimenting with that project. Once you kind of get invested in mushroom growing, suddenly you see it everywhere. So I have this vase. They came out probably about 15 years ago. It's kind of a head with the top of it cut off, and a lot of people grow spider plants out the top of it. But when I seen it in a charity shop, I was like, I need that because I need to grow mushrooms out of it. But I've also got a teapot that's got a hairline crack up at it down the back, so I can't use that as a teapot anymore. So instead I use that for growing mushrooms. A large mason jar is really good, or if you've got a vase or a vessel that you'd like to grow out. It's a project that's been really popular with potters as well, because it gives them the opportunity to kind of throw something of their own form, and they can create their own openings and grow mushrooms from where they want. So again, it's just giving people the opportunity to get growing on their own terms within their own space, and also having an opportunity to kind of experiment a little bit with mushrooms, because it's not overly expensive. It's not a massive investment in time either. As Jodie said earlier, you'll know within 21 days whether it's worked or not, and then you get a crop of not only beautiful mushrooms but delicious mushrooms as well.
Definitely, and it's such a fun journey to share with other people as well. Like whether you're on Instagram and sharing it on Instagram, or my Lady Gardeners group, we meet once a month, and you get new people that come each month, and this like sort of same group of 6 or 7 people. And those 6 or 7 people created a WhatsApp group not that long ago because they wanted to put in some group orders and they just wanted to chat to each other outside of the sessions. And after the mushroom growing session, I'd been there with the book, and we'd done sort of 3 or 4 different projects. I think all 5 of them bought the book when they got home and they ordered their own kits, and then they've been sharing their own pictures and their concerns being like, oh, should it look like this? Does yours look like this? And everyone's kind of really bonded over their process. And then where I've gone, oh, I've left this one to dry out for too long. Like, we did 2 book projects and the first one was perfect. It was exactly how it should have been. And the second one, I just think we missed it being right because we weren't there every day. As well, I was on holiday last week. And it's been so lovely to have that kind of sense of community over everyone sharing their mushroom journey. And because they grow so quickly, you've got something to talk about every day. And it's been really wonderful to see other people as excited, because I was super excited about it. And then you don't quite know how people are going to take it because it's such an unknown. And it really just, everyone was so enthused about it and excited. And I think that we'll all kind of continue our mushroom growing journey together and try lots of new things. So I think it's unlimited possibilities, it seems like, at the minute.
I feel like the mushroom community that we've been very welcomed into over the years is full of, they call it citizen scientists. So it's people like you and me who have got inspired by something, by finding out about this incredible, and then all of a sudden you're in a rabbit hole, and there doesn't appear to be, there's sort of a difference. There's proper mycologists who study the scientifically and research and incredible and delve really deep into it. And there's other people that are just playing around and experimenting, but there's not a hierarchy of you can't do it like this. That's not how we've always done it. It's so open and free sharing of knowledge that nobody that we've met is holding their cards close to their chest. They're all, we've done it like this and this is how you do it, and it's such an incredible community to be a part of, and it's so welcoming. And I think that's why we felt very free to share what we've learned, because we've been welcomed into this community. We're like, look at these people, they're amazing. They're, they know about, I still feel like I've got a bit of imposter syndrome, even though I've been growing mushrooms for many years now, because there's so much more to learn, and there's so many incredible people to learn from that are doing things in new and exciting ways, different substrates, different species, native, re-establishing native species. Like the lion's mane was found, Bristol fungaria, they're incredible. They found there's this lion's mane, useful species, you're not allowed to harvest it. But an unusual thing happened where this lion's mane was on a fallen tree, and so you're like, well, is it okay? So actually they were allowed by the landowner to take a sample, and now they're cloning this native species, and there's lots of science going on about it, but everyone's welcome. And I think it's an amazing space to be, which is why we shout about it so much, that more people need to do it, so we can find out more ways and more exciting things and get more passionate people growing mushrooms and sharing what they do.
I think it's a really good lesson in life as well. Not that the traditional gardening community isn't welcoming, but you do definitely have a large chunk of people that like, that's not how it's done, we don't do it like that, we don't recommend that. And again, in our gardening space, it's very much, this is what we've tried it in these different ways, this has worked for us, this hasn't. It might work better for you because you've got a different space to us. So we're very much the kind of, anything is possible, you can grow anything anywhere, you've just got to find the right way to do it. But I think in life, you kind of expect things to go as planned, and then when they don't, you're really disheartened by it. But I feel like with mushrooms, it's kind of that you're semi-expecting it to go wrong, and when it goes right, you're like, yes. But it's just that trial and error, and I think it, like I said, a really good lesson for life. It just, you can kind of chop and change the way things work, and you discover new things all the time, and it's just really exciting, instead of it always having to be a very siloed way of thinking and a siloed way of working.
Yes, and we're massive advocates of that as well. If it goes wrong, we will always hold our hands up and go, this didn't work. And what's been lovely about exhibiting our mushrooms is as Jodie kind of touched on, this kind of imposter syndrome. So if you notice, I have a lack of houseplants. I don't have a garden, and we exhibit at most of the large flower shows up and down the country. But what's been lovely is we have been welcomed into the community, because everyone's credited for their own, what they do and how they do it. What's nice about the RHS shows, especially when you're exhibiting, we spent a lot of time looking at what other people were doing and trying to see how we could apply that. And what we've had to just keep refocusing on is, like, we don't do what they do. Mushrooms don't do what these plants do. We need to focus and stay true to us. But we're also not in competition with anyone. You're just looked at and graded on, and I suppose judged on your own merits, and what you've achieved and what you've turned up with. So that's been really nice as well.
Yeah, it has been so awesome to see you guys at the shows over the last few years. I wasn't at any of the shows this year, so I didn't see any of the displays in person. But the Hampton Court display, was it last year and the year before? Just epic.
Oh, thank you so much. We always feel like we approach it with something that we want to talk about, and I think that's how, it's not what's it going to look like, so what do we want to communicate and how are we going to do that, and that's always the brief that we work to. So each year we could wheel out the same thing, but actually I think people would be like, wow, mushrooms, saw that, did that. But so we've always got something. So the first year is, you can do this at home, they grow in the light, look at the sculptural beauty. And then this year is, you can do this in a really, because we know that gourmet mushroom growing is not budget friendly, But you can do this in a really budget-friendly way. Straw, sawdust, cardboard, using mushrooms of their own in the stem butt project to grow from. And so that's what we want to communicate, and that's what we're working on now, is our next story for what we want to say. Because I don't know if you noticed that we really like talking.
The best kind of people, my kind of people. I feel like we could continue chatting for another few hours, but I know we've only got a few minutes left. So I would love to hear like an experience, which you might have already shared it, but an experience that's really stuck with you from your mushroom growing journey, as like whether it's a key pivotal moment or a moment where you just really felt a sense of satisfaction and kind of achievement.
Well, I think there's been so many highlights. I've just put a little document together actually for a proposal we're working on, and I wanted to list at the back some of the people that we've been working with, and that alone, I suppose, just literally 15 minutes ago, was a real proud moment, because we were able to list people like Wakehurst, like Kew Gardens, like Arit Anderson, lots of really inspiring people out there, and not necessarily within the horticultural business, but within ceramics, within design, the people and the doors and the people that have opened doors up for us. Has been really lovely. We are in a completely different industry to what we studied in, to what we had a work experience in, and we've been welcomed in. So I suppose that is probably my proudest moment, based on what I'm working on at the moment, I think.
That's awesome.
Our whole career in business is a pinch me moment, and I think that's what's important, is that we don't lose touch of that, because we are an incredible space working with, like yourself, incredible people that are inspirational and kind and uplifting. And I think that, I don't think there's a one single thing. I think we're blown away by what we're doing, how we're doing it, and who we're working with.
I think I would echo that and say in my completely different business, that is exactly the highlight of what we do, is just that meeting new exciting people, and kind of the avenues that you never know when they're going to pop up. You meet someone and they introduce you to someone else, or they kind of make a suggestion that just changes your whole perception of even like the tiniest thing. Someone suggested to us that we should do an adopt a plant stand or station for people who think that they're not very good at gardening, and whether they adopt a plant we keep in our garden and we send them updates, or that they can take home and grow on themselves. And I was like, that's such a good idea, and we have so many people that can't reach us in our space because we're just 10 minutes out of the town centre, but it's not accessible by bus, so unless you drive you can't access it. And so now we're looking at places that we can put in the town centre, like adopt a plant, take home, it's very similar to what you guys do, just giving people that whole hand to hold to say, like, you can do this, and once you've proved to them that they can grow one thing, then they get excited and they try something else, and that's kind of how the growing journey starts.
No, it's an incredible place to be, like you say, hand holding and having our hands held, so we're very grateful for all of it.
Well, I'm very grateful for having you today. Before we go, can you just let everyone know where they can find your book and your kits and all of your amazing resources? Because you guys on the internet have just got so much exciting information, how-tos, kits, advice, all of that stuff.
Oh, thank you. Yes, so we Instagram and social media, so our handle is @Caley Brothers, that's CALEY Brothers. Our website is caleybrothers.co.uk, and then we've got our book, which is Project Mushroom, and there are loads of different places you can get this. So where you usually buy your books, or local retailers have got it as well, but lots of places to get the book.
I actually saw it in real life in Kew Gardens last week, and it was one of those moments where I was walking through the gift shop and I was like, oh my god, look, and my boyfriend was looking at me going, don't you have that book? I was like, yes, but it's the book in Kew Gardens, so it's extra exciting. And he was like, I can't believe you're taking a photo with that book. I was like, no, this is like it's almost like seeing a celeb.
We do the same. If there's a bookshop, I'm like, kids, come on, we're going.
Yeah.
But they're now like up and through the rooms and the floors and the various bookshops to try and find it themselves. It's just a different sort of mushroom spotting, that's all.
It is, I love it. Well, thank you so much, ladies. It's been such a pleasure to chat to you, and I can't wait to see what's next.